Hello and welcome. And today I'm really lucky to be joined by Trevor Gordon, who's the CDTO, that's Chief Digital Technology Officer at Save the Children UK. Hi, Trevor.
Hi, Stuart. Thank you for the invite. Really enjoy the format. Yeah, and have recently joined Save, and it's been 6 months. And so it's been a whirlwind start, really fun, really great, and great to be back in this sector after a long time away.
Yeah, so I was keen to chat to you as well because I know you've worked in different sectors. But first of all, I'm keen to hear about the actual role itself, CDTO, which sounds like it's a mixture of digital data transformation. Can you tell us a little bit about what a CDTO role is?
Yeah, of course. So when I was approached for the role, I think Save had recognized that, in terms of where it wanted to go, in terms of its, say, strategic vision and plan, that they really saw the need to leverage digital data and technology and disruptive technologies and ways of working and all those things is looking to see what did they need to make that happen. And I think one of the things they saw was they recognized the importance of digital data and technology in terms of actually being the catalyst for change in that organization. We have a program called Organization of the Future, which is a really ambitious program, and kind of all the things around agile transformation, becoming more data driven, more automation, more workflow, leveraging things like AI is really important. And so I was brought in to kind of look and lead that, what we call that DDAT transformation. And so 6 months into the role, we've made a lot of progress, still a lot to do. And my remit covers largely digital data technology, leaning in on transformation and other aspects. So, we're moving to much more of a less hierarchical organization, more a way around of, very much focused around human-centric design, service design, really a laser-like focus on our strategy, how we deliver our services, and that continual improvement. So what I've liked about it was it wasn't just not your traditional rigid keep the lights on and run the technology, but a chance to work across the business to really help deliver that transformation.
I guess when you've got that mixture of digital data and technology and the elements of transformation, that some of those bits are spread out around the organization, and there's different models of having centralized bits and devolved bits and hub and spoke type models, and trying to get that to work well, especially when you've got lots of history where you've probably had, like, fundraising teams who've got a lot of data expertise, and you've probably had digital spread out in different areas, I'm guessing, and trying to bring that all into a coordinated way of working can be a challenge. And I don't know the journey that Sate's been on, and if you're the start of that journey or the end of that journey, you've turned up and it's all been working nicely.
You've articulated some of the challenges very well, Stuart, obviously from your previous experience and knowledge. And you've kind of hit the nail on the head there, which is charities like Say, charities like you would have worked at, we deliver very important services, working with sensitive information, very important life-changing things. But I think sometimes what I've seen in previous organizations, and I can see sometimes where we're maybe at fault of in this sector, is we overcomplicate our business. Actually, if we look at it, our business models are actually fairly simple. We deliver services to children. We do humanitarian. It's we do policy advocacy and campaigning. We do fundraising and marketing. We do humanitarian, and we do this work. And it's not to say that that work is not complicated, complex, challenging to deliver. But in terms of what that entails as a business model, it's fairly straightforward. And one of the things, as if we look at, say, Save the Children UK, we have about 850 employees, but we have silos within silos within silos within our teams. I've had people that have been there for 10 years that didn't know another person existed doing the same thing in another part of the organization. So part of what we're looking at in terms of our transformation is, to your point, is how do we simplify? How do we build those kind of almost mission squads or those value streams to actually get those multifunctioning teams working together to work more efficiently, effectively, and cut through, let's say, that kind of traditional hierarchical systems to do that. We're at the start of our journey with that, but we have a real lot of buy-in from the fellow exec where it's a case of we see where we want to get to with organization in the future, but realize we need to do it in a way that's going to be incremental, sustainable, and embedding, and it's not going to happen overnight. It's a multi-year journey to get there. So we're at the start of that journey, a lot of great people there, but that's part of what attracted me to the role was the ambition of the organization and that kind of vision.
Which leads me to, prior to Save the Children, you've worked in some commercial organizations, and I'm
Mm,
really interested if you've noticed any differences, if you've noticed how the
mm.
charity sector
Yeah.
handles challenges versus the commercial sector.
So previously to this, I was in very similar type leadership roles in Diageo, in Vodafone, in Sodexo, View Cinemas, Selfridges. And obviously, a lot of those organizations are, let's say, large global multinationals. Like Diageo was sixth biggest company in the FTSE, as an example. The time we were working there was a really ambitious customer transformation. And, a lot of the challenges you would see from a commercial to a third or public sector, very similar. Um, but let's say where you would look at, say, in terms of commercial drivers in a private sector organization, you're basing it based on commercial uplift, on savings, on efficiencies, things like this. And it's actually, I think, if you look in the charitable sector, that actually a bit of more of that, say, kind of commercial perspective, where you want that simplification. Obviously, your measures and drivers are going to be different. How do you measure and have KPIs around delivering impact for children? I also think in terms of, let's say, that rigor around decision making and that robustness around governance and corporate structures. I think there is something there. What I've seen in the charity sector after returning from 15 years is that the charity is never going to have the budget or the resources are there. We have good people, but I would say the sector is behind the private sector in terms of leveraging things like data and analytics, in terms of leveraging disruptive technologies like AI. And the sector is actually falling further behind because a lot of times I've seen the traditional in the sector is more of like, we can't do that rather than the focus of how could we make that happen rather than saying we can't do that from a data protection or an IT security or for whatever reason. And I think that at least at SAVE and where the sector's at a critical point is there is some learnings from the commercial sector. And I think what I see now in the sector is it's more outward looking. It's like we should be looking at best practice in the public sector. A lot of what they're doing there in service design is amazing in GDS, for instance. Or we should be looking at examples for example, from the commercial sector. It doesn't mean to say that there's not that thought leadership in the charitable sector, but we should be looking at examples across the board. So I think that in terms of where the charitable sector is now, it is behind and falling further behind. And having a bit more rigor around organizational strategy, focused, and rigor around we try and do 1,000 things. Let's have a real laser light focus on what that vision is, that North Star. What is the strategy to deliver that, and make sure that the money we're having, that we're investing, and it's just not financial investment. It's the focus of your energy, your staff resources, of getting everyone aligned to deliver of this is where we're going, this is the direction of travel, rather than trying to do 1,000 things, maybe not having that follow through to do it. So I think having come back into the sector, at least with SAVE in the humanitarian space, I see it being at quite a critical time where the nature of the humanitarian, you've worked in the space before, the nature of humanitarian relief through Gaza and all that is really changing. And the ability and the role that digital data technology, AI, disruptive technologies play can not only help, say, catch up, but also help accelerate that, if that makes sense. Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense, and you've nicely encapsulated nearly all of the key themes we've had throughout this podcast series there. I picked up on them all, talking around decision making and how charities need to get good at making decisions and making them effectively and making them quickly, and that in the episode I did with Laura Dawson, we talked a little bit about how finance teams have a very clear method of making decision delegated limits of authority, and that's been there for years and years and years, and that's so mature and well embedded. But in terms of technology, the understanding around how technology decisions are made is not nearly as clear, and that's spread across the organization in different
You're,
ways.
you're entirely right. And we have a similar challenge here, whereas one of the things we're looking to put in at SAVE is our previous technology strategy was almost based on a project by project thing. Oh, we need a new CRM. Let's go and do that. We need to replace our ERP. Let's do that. Whereas actually looking at that sustainable and scalable enterprise architecture. So to your point, that where the traditional, let's say, capital and OPEX expenditure isn't slightly there, that it's been that delegated line of authority. And actually, a lot of the change that is required is over a multi-year investment. And then if you're starting to get in on aspects of more product-led agile delivery, our financial structures and governance isn't actually attributed to that. So, doing a traditional RFP and then let's say a really long business case on one-hour project, whereas actually what you're trying to move to is more that continual delivery and improvement for that. The whole way of how you do your decision making in terms of your governance delivery and how that's run needs to change. I had the similar challenge at Diageo of how do you talk about moving something to say like scaled agile or safe or something like that, but you've got to bring through your governance and your portfolio management and all of your, let's say, financial controls and measures in line with that. And it's a big change. And that's something, for example, let's say we're looking at now. And, you can look at how you go from A to B, but it's a cultural mindset change that is required as well, which is really, really important. And realizing that you need to put the effort on in that, if that makes sense.
It definitely makes sense. I know I've worked on programs where, from a technology side, we want to work in an agile way, and that's what works best in terms of program. But in terms of the decision making, the organization is set up to make decisions in a stage gate waterfall type
Well,
way.
yeah, I agree, Stuart. And it's even looking at that way of getting that mindset in the teams. I think there is, let's say, some of the difference from a large global organization like Diageo, say more to like a View Cinemas, was as an example, where you could put in more of that whole product way of working across the organization, where there was a real understanding and say a maturity where you had those high performing teams and functions. So as an example, a product owner in terms of deciding on functionality or direction of a development, say of a supporter-facing app or a digital data and analytics, and that person would understand and then be empowered to understand what decisions they were making and drive that forward. Whereas, let's say, maybe in some of the previous charities I'd worked at, it was quite hierarchical. So even getting decision-making up and down is that you would have throughout the organization almost that death spiral of indecision, which is we want to consult everyone and ask everyone, and everyone's got an opinion on anything, which charities are very, very, very nice and sometimes too nice. And there's not that robustness around decision making and governance and just getting on with things. And at the same time, you know, we're not aiming for perfection. In a lot of cases, we're trying to make marginal improvements to imperfect systems or products or services. And it's the cumulative gain of those marginal improvements, which is really going to drive that change or that increased value. And that change in mindset is really, really challenging.
That was nicely put there, actually. The cumulative value comes from all of the smaller changes. And what I've seen in the past where I've put this in place is a product partnership where you have someone from the line of business working with someone from the technology side of things. And between them, it's their responsibility to make that decision on the product rather than pushing it upwards.
You're 100% right, Stuart. I think this is one of the things we were talking earlier before we got on about the sharing of best practice in the sector. And what I've seen coming back into that is a really willingness to do that because we all have similar challenges and similar constraints. And let's say the old school view of technology being stuck in the basement, just making sure the servers are on and fixing laptops, that can't and shouldn't exist anymore. And that strategic partnering with the business to help drive that. I've actually tried to get my team to say, we are the business as well. So it's that change in mindset is there. And I think so we see very much at say, for example, willingness for that. And, we see that DDAT function, as we're calling it there, is that catalyst for change. But it's also realizing, to your point, that mindset and building that organizational muscle to have that capability to be able to do that with the right partners takes time.
Can I just step back a little bit? One of the other interesting points you mentioned back in when you were talking was around risk. That draws on a point that one of our other guests made on a previous podcast. And I think I'd be interested to hear your perspective of it. So I think it was about episode 6, and we had an entrepreneur, a guy called Sanjay Lobo, who runs a volunteering app. It's a startup, a technology startup, and it's called On Hand. But they've done this really interesting model where they're matching volunteers to people who need help, and they use an app to do this. But one of the things that Sanjay pushed very hard on was that he thought that the charity sector was too risk averse. He was pointing out some of the things that he'd done with his app and some of the things around the NHS Responder app, what they'd done in terms of linking people together. And he said that the charity sector would really have struggled with these because they would have got caught up in far too many risks. And they, first of all, would have talked themselves out of doing it. But even if they had enabled themselves to do it, it would have taken them months or years to actually do it because they would have had to reassure themselves on the
Oh,
risk. And I, when he was saying that, me with my charity background wanted to shout out to him, no, but you don't understand, because we've always got so much vulnerable data that we're looking out for, and we must make sure that we're safeguarding that data. But there was a tension there, and I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
I I need to go back and listen to that episode because I wholeheartedly agree with your previous guest. I think he's fully right. If we look at the changing nature of humanitarian work, the old days of there's a disaster in Somalia or Ethiopia, you get money out of a safe, get someone on a plane, fly out there and do stuff. There will be that element. But where it's moving is around the capacity building, the capability building, the localization, the partnership building. And the role of data and analytics and things like AI is going to play a huge part in that. And the interoperability with those smaller charities and those partner charities to be able to, it could be anonymized aggregated data sets, but the ability to have some of those interoperability of your systems, processes, and potentially data is hugely important. And you need the policies and the foundations in place to be able to do that. I think the natural charitable reaction of, no, we can't do this, needs to be more of, what are we trying to do? What outcomes are we trying to do? How do we start to potentially look at ways to make that happen? And so I think that kind of, I'd say almost commercial mindset is more needed rather than the traditional of we can't do it. Hopefully that makes sense. Yeah.
It does make sense, and I'm going to delve a little bit deeper on it because I'm interested. So we have a few trustees who listen in on this podcast, and I know that risk within an organization, there's a variety of different elements that go to make up that approach to risk. There's you'll generally have some sort of legal team, as you mentioned. You've got a great general counsel. You'll have an executive team. You'll have the trustees, and you'll have maybe in the subject area. So here we're talking about technology, and they're all pulling together. The trustees. Generally, trustees will have some sort of audit and risk committee, which will
Yeah.
be reviewing organizational approaches to risks. You'll have some massive risk register. And that's an awful lot of different governance levels. And all of those governance levels need to be working effectively together if you're going to update your approach to risk. I'm really thinking about now the trustees. Do you have any thoughts on what trustees can be doing to help us shift this?
We have some new trustees and are really forward-looking, thinking trustees. But before we do that, we also have a new person that has been in the organization for about 8 months. And she's doing some great work around changing the narrative in the approach of looking at more of an enterprise level risk management, where some of it was more siloed either in a function, division, or a project or program. And by raising risk up at an enterprise level of which it should be, the discussion is much more strategic around what are the opportunities of matching this to ensure, if we think this is our 2030 vision, our 3-year 25-27 strategy, some of our challenges, it's ensuring that we've got that kind of framework and the criteria to assess that that there's a tolerance of risk, but you need the input into that. And using that methodology and that approach to guide and instruct the proactive discussion with your trustees and your governance to make informed recommendations and making sure they're getting the right information that's data driven and data led is super important. And I think that, I'd been a trustee at a charity, and I'd also interacted a lot in previous charities with trustees as we're doing here now. And us being clear of what decisions we're actually asking them and what recommendations. So the whole approach we're taking around enterprise risk, I think, is very similar to what I would have seen at Diageo or a Vodafone or a larger global corporate. I think it's right. And I see the need for that and the way that you handle the machination of governance in charities is a real room for improvement.
Okay, wow. I just paused there as trying to digest this.
Does that make sense?
It does make sense because I'm thinking about the way that good decision making plays into or interacts with very an enterprise risk management approach,
Mhm.
and these two things, which on the face of it you might want to stumble into technology and digital and say, oh well, we're all about doing the amazing stuff. Decision making, oh yeah, that's all governance. Well, what about risk? That's enterprise risk. That's a different thing. But what we're getting to here is that actually at the heart of really effective technology change are some of the good old fashioned things like proper enterprise risk management, really effective decision making, which have been around for as long as companies have been around. They're not
Well,
they're not new technology.
this is it. And this is where I talk about corporate structure and corporate rigor and governance, which is to have that in place. So, you're making those informed recommendations. A recommendation might not be no, but if we look at digital data and technology, I'd be very surprised of probably some of your guests previously from other charities that there's an element of digital data or technology that touches almost every area of the business. And I use the word business because we are run like businesses. And like a business, you should be focused on where you're adding most value to your communities and customers that you serve. And how do I always like to think of back when I worked in charities, I always used with my teams, particularly like at Childline or Alzheimer's Society, where we had a lot of marathon runners and it was for unrestricted. I used to put our terms of spend of how many marathons is that? How long did it take that person how long did it take that person to train to raise 1,500 quid for that marathon? I still take the same view. I treat it as if it's my money. At a charity, it's even more because the more money we can give to our frontline services, to the communities and children we serve, the better. And that's how we should be looking at it. There's investment we need to make, but let's make sure it's the right investment in the right way and that we're doing all the other aspects to get the money out of it. And to your point, there needs to be that robustness around strategy, focus, and decision making on there, which I think sometimes charities can get in that death spiral of indecision, or they're very consensus led organizations where everyone just goes off and do their own thing, which is probably maybe not the most efficient, effective use of these increasingly constrained resources and money.
So the theme of this podcast, the overall theme of this podcast was around AI, and there was a concern. I started it out with a concern that there would be lots of new capabilities available from Gen AI, from AI in general,
Mhm.
and that charities would struggle to keep up with the private sector because charities had different approaches and because charities didn't have the money to invest. And so I'm going to come full circle then on the whole discussion we've just had and come back to what Safe is doing with AI. Can you tell me, does all of this fit together nicely? Do you think this will actually enable charities to move forward more quickly with the adoption of AI?
Yeah, I think so, because some of the things we're doing is like we just finalized yesterday our AI usage policy because we know we have, for example, areas of the business using ChatGPT. I'm not going to turn that off because it adds to their value. And we also know that colleagues of mine in the humanitarian space, which we're working to proactively looking at, is looking at the use of AI in some of like our humanitarian opportunities. Well, the other thing we put in place is we're putting in place an AI council. So in effect, a light touch governance within the organization. So to ensure that we've got that mechanism around new initiatives and things coming in, so we can actually just have some control around it. So it's not to add another layer of bureaucracy or there, but just to add, say, some governance in place and some structure around it. So getting those foundations in place. So even if we start using Copilot tomorrow, the actual foundations we're getting in place with this is going to be really valuable. And I've seen the outputs that Microsoft are working on for the wider public sector. I do think there is some real potential value there in terms of the adoption of wider AI, just not Microsoft products, for other charities. Yeah.
And so you mentioned an AI council, you mentioned an AI usage policy. Those two things are things which I'm repeating again because there's smaller charities that don't have the resources of, say, the children who I've spoken to who struggle a lot with trying to understand how on earth do we move forward? What are the key things we need to have in place? And I think from everything I've heard that from different charities, those are two real common themes: having some sort of overarching governance group around it, something that tells people what they can and they can't do and gives the organization some guidelines. And then the third one, which I've heard quite often, is that AI shouldn't be treated as a technology thing. It should be treated as an organizational approach. Is
Exactly.
that something you've seen as well?
Absolutely. Because I see a lot of organizations struggling to see where AI actually sits. And um, it needs to be organizational because you need to look at what outcomes are you going to drive with it. Is it an actual strategic business tool? And that's what our council's formed like, where it's representation from, well, it will be DDAT, tech, legal. It will be each of the different business areas. So we put a lot of work in terms of, say, building up that knowledge of those team in house. So in terms of the pilot we're doing, we've got great representation and intake throughout the business. And exactly to that point. And I think just starting simple with all these things is great because you take that iterative approach, you build it out with the handbrake on, you start to run a POC or something, show some value, get those foundations in place. And that's how you can start to move into other areas. And to me, it comes back that the sector's behind and falling further behind. And if we don't take a bit more of a proactive view to adopting and leveraging some of these, you know, the days of monolithic SaaS platforms are always going to be there, but digital data and analytics and things like AI and Gen AI, all the things you mentioned, are could potentially what really help accelerate the sector ahead from being behind where it currently is.
Which is a really great positive note to end on there. Before we go, Trevor, do you have any other things we haven't touched on that you wanted to mention?
No, just really enjoyed the chat. I'm going to go back and listen to episode 6.
Yeah, I hope you've got the episode numbers right. I'm pretty sure it was episode. It was
No,
about
I just no, just to say, as previously discussed, I really like the format and what you're doing because I think anything that encourages information sharing and best practice, and also not best practice, probably with some of the stuff I've talked about, is great. So no, just really a fan of the show and think a great format.
thank you very much, and I'm going to try and get some more not encourage guests to do more not best practice as well, because that's one of the things that always helps you learn, isn't it? The successes and the failures. All right, well, thank you very much, Trevor. It's been really brilliant chatting to you today, and I wish you well in your role at Save the Children.
Thank you, Stuart.